Hello. I was going to start by taking out this speech and reading it and saying hooray, and then realizing that's the other speech. We were not successful in the motion, but good evening to everyone, and thank you for joining me today to discuss the vote and what's next. So I want to first point out that we have had a good, healthy debate. It doesn't mean that I agree with everything that's been said, but it proves once and for all that we Canadians are very capable of having a good democratic exchange of views even when we're passionate. Policy differences about the dignity and worth of every human being, and even about abortion, although highly important, can be explored through open dialogue. And those who didn't think that Canadians were ready for or capable of having a respectful dialogue have been proven wrong. Second, I want to thank the many, many Canadians from one end of the country to the other who took time to send tens of thousands of messages to members of Parliament asking them to support Motion 312. I've received hundreds of petitions with thousands and thousands of signatures in support of Motion 312, and I know that other MPs have received others. I've received thousands of personal messages from across Canada, and 83% of them were in favor. I'm certain that this helped a number of MPs to cast their vote in support of Motion 312. And of course, it's also been very encouraging to me and to others who are fighting for the dignity and worth of every human being. And so my heart simply goes out in thanks from the bottom of my heart to all of those Canadians. Now, I'm sure that the thousands of Canadians who took time to write asking Parliament to support Motion 312's effort to resolve this issue, and the millions more who agree with them, will be very disappointed that Parliament turned down this opportunity to work toward consensus. Just on Tuesday, I filed petitions from approximately 1,300 residents of the Markham-Unionville riding area who will be very disappointed with their MP for voting against Motion 312. And also this week, I filed petitions from approximately 2,500 residents of the Scarborough-Rouge River area who will be very disappointed with their MP for voting against Motion 312. So I just want to remind these disappointed Canadians of an aphorism I heard a few months ago. The next best thing to fighting for justice and winning is to fight for justice and lose. The worst thing would be to not fight for justice at all. So I've done my job as a member of Parliament by bringing to light subsection 223(1), the most vile, the most unjust law in Canada. Canadians are now aware that barbarically our law does not even recognize as human a child until the moment of complete birth. And I've done my job by proposing the mildest, most unobjectionable means for dealing with this law. The defeat of Motion 312 means that the question left open by Justice Bertha Wilson in 1988 and by the Supreme Court of Canada ever since, how to honor universal rights in Canada, will remain open and unresolved. That remains Parliament's responsibility, however hard we might try to avoid it. This issue was never closed, and it's not closed now, and will never be closed if we in Parliament continue to stick our collective head in the sand. I want Canadians to remember that no great issue is ever settled by a single vote in the House of Commons. It remains for the Canadian people to rise up even more strongly in defense of honest laws and universal human rights, which are so shamefully violated by subsection 223(1). Just going to take a few more minutes of this statement, and then I'll be happy to answer questions. I think Canadians are going to conclude that much of what was said by those speaking against Motion 312 in the parliamentary debate lacked any coherence or logic. Many speakers against Motion 312 in that debate showed that they were willing to abandon time-honored Canadian values in a single-minded, personal preoccupation with abortion, no matter how grave the consequences. In the previous Parliament, some of these same MPs, with the same intransigent personal preoccupation with abortion, stopped Parliament from denouncing men who coerce women into having abortions. For them, even protecting women could not trump protecting abortion. An example from the Motion 312 debate, NDP members, with their extreme personal preoccupation with abortion, actually suggested that we give the Prime Minister power to veto private members' motions. Can you imagine that? They proposed to take away one of the most effective democratic tools left to MPs in the face of an MP's diminishing role. Now, if you're willing to sacrifice important democratic institutions like the independence of private members' business just because of a personal preoccupation with abortion, what won't you give up? Now, I'm confident that Canadians can convince those MPs that democratic institutions are more important than their personal preoccupation with abortion. Also, a number of MPs who spoke against Motion 312 in the parliamentary debate, in their single-minded preoccupation with abortion, actually trashed the whole Canadian tradition of open-minded dialogue. There's nothing to talk about, they said. We're right, you're wrong, we like what we've got, so go away and don't bother us. Well, I don't know what people will think across the country, but I say this is just blind arrogance. This is intransigence of the worst sort. This is intolerance of other points of view. They will not offer an inch of compromise or tolerate an ounce of dissent. Well, I'm confident that Canadians can win the argument that democratic dialogue is more important even than a preoccupation with abortion. Here's another example. The MPs who spoke in favor of shielding subsection 223(1) from 21st century science and advances in modern understanding were quite willing to say that their personal preoccupation with abortion is more important than the need for our laws to honestly reflect reality. Unbelievably, they advocated shutting their eyes to scientific evidence and advances in modern understanding. Unbelievably, those who spoke against Motion 312 want Canadians to believe that our abortion practices depend upon the pretense that a child is not a human being, even if the evidence establishes otherwise. But Canadians know that no just law can ever be based on the lie that someone is not a human being when they are. In a civilized society, it is absolutely abhorrent to even legally pretend that someone we know to be human is not human. And I'm sure that Canadians can win the argument that the need for our laws to honestly reflect reality comes ahead of any preoccupation with abortion. I'm going to provide one last, I think, shameful example where extreme personal preoccupation with abortion led some of those who spoke against Motion 312. By shielding subsection 223(1), they said that their preoccupation with abortion is more important than defending the equal and inherent worth and dignity of every human being which subsection 223(1) denies. To those who spoke against motion 312, their focus on abortion actually justifies abandoning the principles of equality and human rights which are at the heart of Canadian democracy. That's appalling. Can you imagine any country in the world other than Canada where a member of Parliament would actually stand up in front of the nation and suggest, as one Liberal member did, that studying how best to recognize the dignity and worth of every human being is the first step on a slippery slope? Well, any country aside from North Korea, that is, as my colleague from Langley reminded us during the debate. If one is so personally preoccupied with abortion that you find yourself saying that studying the equality of every human being is a slippery slope, I say give your head a shake. It's incredibly dangerous to say that recognizing every human being as a human being with inherent worth and dignity is the first step on a slippery slope. That kind of thinking doesn't belong in the Parliament of Canada, and that member's constituents should take a good, hard second look at anyone who can say such an alarming thing. But I'm confident that Canadians ultimately will successfully defend the principle that the inherent worth and dignity of every human being is even more important than being preoccupied with abortion. So what's next? Well, first of all, I'm going to have to shave my beard. My wife doesn't like it, and I love my wife dearly, so it's going to be gone. But more seriously, I want to repeat that I have great faith in the people of Canada, and I have confidence that there is a strong consensus across Canada that a dishonest law like subsection 223(1) must not be tolerated. And I have enough faith in Canadians to believe that there's a strong consensus across Canada that our laws must recognize the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. The only place where this consensus still needs to be encouraged is in the House of Commons. Canadians have to swallow their disappointment in Parliament's decision this evening, but Canadians have to redouble their efforts to promote the view that intransigence will take us nowhere, and that the equality and worth of every human being are more important than any other agenda or ideology or preoccupation. That's the Canada that we all really want. Now, I won't have an opportunity for a long time, because of the rules of Parliament, to take another private member's motion forward to a vote. However, of course, I'll continue to fight. I'll be there to encourage. I'll be there to speak out in defense of the Canadian values championed by Motion 312. I'll be there to share the understanding and experience that I've gained. And of course, I will continue to make serving my constituents my chief priority, just as I have done even through the last 10 months of promoting Motion 312. If the circumstances permit, I'm happy to travel the country to meet Canadians and to explain and talk about the very, very grave importance of enshrining in Canadian law the equal and inherent worth and dignity of every human being. And I can't do that alone. I know that I need the help of all Canadians, and I'm asking all Canadians to join me in those efforts. Canadians must continue to believe in progress and continue to have faith in the future. Science and advances in modern understanding are going to drag Parliament into the 21st century despite the vote on Motion 312. 21st century medical realities are going to prevent Parliament from shielding subsection 223(1) forever. The sweep of history is on the side of justice and human rights. So thank you all very much for listening to that little summation, and as always, I welcome questions. Yes, Ms. Giappone.
You had 10 cabinet ministers and 4 liberals, and the majority of the Conservative caucus supporting motion 312. Were you surprised at the level of support?
I will say that it was a pleasant realization that the level of support did exceed my expectations a bit, and certainly I'm very grateful to all of the people that you've mentioned, because I know that this isn't an easy thing to do for all people, and quite honestly, I think that by engaging in the discussion that we've had, I hope at the very least I've demonstrated that actually it's easy to talk about legal principles and about evidence, and if you keep your eye on the choices directly in front of you and don't get distracted, that doing the right thing is easy. And so I'm really very, very grateful to all of the people that you mentioned. Yes, sir.
Dave Koch, writing for MediaCoop.ca, and just outside there was a protest just now with a number of members of the NDP, and Irene Matheson, pointed out that this project, this motion, is coming from people who have opposed affordable housing, national child care strategy, pay equity. Cut funding for groups advocating for women, like Sass Women Canada. So when you're talking about so how would you respond to people who are saying that this talk about equality is actually kind of in contradiction to those measures?
I don't suppose Miss Matheson is a lawyer. If she was, she might have a little bit of training in the process of considering ideas. And the reality is that we are here in Parliament not to do anything except consider ideas. And if an idea is a good idea, then really it ought not to matter where it's coming from. And in fact, as I mentioned a few days ago, it's an old trick for people who don't really want to discuss ideas, or at least not to discuss the specific ideas on the table, to try to distract from them by attacking the person who's proposing them. It's shooting the messenger if you don't like the message. In academic terms, it's called the ad hominem fallacy. I could go on at length about that, but if you have a little bit of training in the discussion of ideas, you realize how very wrong that is. And I'll go even further and say, you know what? If Miss Matheson had a good idea, I'd go along with it, even if it came from her. Any other? Yes.
You were mentioning that because of the rules of Parliament, you won't be able to come back very quickly with another private member's bill. What do you expect will be the next move for those who supported your bill, who want to see these issues, these kinds of issues addressed?
Well, I've tried to allude to the fact that I hope people all across Canada will really take to heart, will be moved to advocate that we enshrine in Canadian law the inherent worth and dignity of every human being. And this necessarily involves dealing with subsection 223(1). So I hope that people will understand across Canada the fundamental, foundational importance of that to the kind of country that we want to have, and that they will continue to try to convince those who don't agree with it. And as for members of Parliament, the future will unfold as it should. I can't speak for anyone else.
What do you think? Are you optimistic that one day, sooner than later, one of your colleagues will be able to bring that kind of private bill?
The kind that I have proposed, you mean? What I've done? I think, of course, that in a democracy, everyone should be able to propose private members' legislation on matters of importance. And so far, at least, I've demonstrated that we can do that. The real question is, at what point will Parliament join the consensus developing across the country in favor of equal rights and in favor of recognizing the dignity and worth of every human being? And you know, the members of this Parliament have spoken today. Perhaps some of them will have a change of heart in the years to come, but I can't predict.
But is it your wish that someone can take the relay?
Well, it is my wish that we will all continue to try to persuade others that a preoccupation with abortion should not stand in the way of other important issues. And those, in my view, include the necessity to enshrine in Canadian law the dignity and worth of every human being. Now, how that will be articulated by other members of Parliament or in what procedural manner, I cannot predict.
Your motion didn't pass today, but it did get the support of what looked to be the majority of the Conservative caucus. Have you given any thought to the idea of bringing this before a committee where the Conservatives are in a majority and having the committee choose to study this issue rather than needing to go through the whole House of Commons to launch the exercise?
It would be an option that I wouldn't rule out, but I think we would find that most committees' agendas are set collaboratively by the House leader and party leaders, and I can only speculate whether or not they would take a different view of that than they did of my motion.
So do you think your own party might, at that level, not cooperate with getting a committee to give this the kind of hearing that you were hoping for with your motion?
Well, I can only say that the decisions that are made by standing committees are generally done collaboratively between the leadership of all three parties. And you all know here that the leadership of all three parties did not support my motion. So I could only speculate about whether they would choose to support the same study in a standing committee that they did not support in a special committee.
Probably answered that already, but I arrived late. I'm sorry, but this motion was about just creating a committee to discuss the issue, and yet it was defeated. So I was wondering, what hope is there left for you that this issue will ever be discussed in Parliament and resolved the way you wanted it to be resolved?
Well, I during the last several months have received literally hundreds of petitions with thousands of signatures from Canadians all across the country, representing, I'm certain, millions more. The House of Commons post office actually got overloaded because there were tens of thousands of messages sent to members of Parliament in support of what I'm proposing. And I'm not just kidding you when I say I really do believe that the people of Canada have a consensus about this. I'll remind you of the Environics poll from the October 2011, which asked people, now that you know, they told people first that Canadian law does not recognize the humanity or interests or rights of children until the moment of complete birth, and they asked people, do you think that we should have a law which does, and what kind of law would you like to see? And the results of that survey indicated that 72% of Canadians actually agreed with the suggestion that Justice Bertha Wilson made 25 years or more ago, that that point should be sometime no later than the second trimester of a child's development. So there actually is a huge consensus out there for a law of some sort. I believe there was another poll done just a few months ago along the same line, and I think the figure came out at around 60%. So let us say between 60 and 72% of Canadians agree that this is a law that should be changed, that this law that says the moment of complete birth is a magical transformation between a non-human entity and a human being should be changed.
Commons is the first place to change that, and today they voted against it.
Correct.
So my question was, what hope is there left for you?
Well, I don't know about you, but I'm a believer in democracy. The great thing about democracy is that the House of Commons ultimately will respond to the will of the people. And it sometimes takes a little work. I was thinking on the way over here, I probably getting the statistics wrong, but I think I heard something along the line that Abraham Lincoln ran 19 times before he finally got elected. So I think that providing we have faith in democracy, providing we understand that technology isn't going to stand still. You know, when we think that we can actually detect a child's brain waves now well before birth, just think of what other advances will be made in the next 10 or 20 years. I'm very confident that ultimately you will see a change in the House of Commons, which will reflect the desire to enshrine the dignity and worth of every human being in Canadian law.
Do you think he would have won if Mr. Harper didn't position himself against you?
It's idle to speculate, but I will say that many of my colleagues, like me, respect and admire Mr. Harper. And by virtue of that and by virtue of his position and the respect owed to his position, he is certainly a persuasive man. And I'd love to have him on my team.
I was wondering, what does it, sorry, just gonna start it again in English, it's difficult sometimes. What does it mean to you that you had the support from the Minister Ambrose?
Yes. May I just, before I answer that, go back to the other question? I didn't finish my sentence. I should have said I'd love to have Mr. Harper on my team in relation to Motion 312, because in virtually every other respect, I think that he is and I are in quite a great deal of agreement. And as for Minister Ambrose, I'm certainly very grateful to her for reflecting the desire that I have on this issue to ensure that, in fact, our law does treat every human being as created equal and as having an inherent worth and dignity. You know, there is a bit of a fallacy here that I have to mention because, you know, if you listen to certain parties, you would think that every woman in Canada is so preoccupied with the issue of abortion as to want to leave behind all of these other honored traditions of Canadian heritage. And it isn't so. If you know, I was wishing I would have gone through all the petitions I received. There was thousands and thousands of names and tried to analyze all of them. But the ones that I looked at, it was pretty representative of the demographics of our population, 50% female, 50% male. I think women understand that it is a false position to believe that anyone's rights depend on dehumanizing or excluding any other human being. There is no real security for anyone in saying that I have to protect my rights by pretending that someone else is not a human being the way that subsection 223(1) does. And I know that women across the country understand that.
There were far more people that voted for your motion than the pro-life movement has identified as pro-life MPs. Do you have any idea how many were people that are pro-choice, but they were willing to at least have the conversation?
Well, you know me well enough to know that what I'm about to say isn't intended as much of a critique, but I want to say that I think another fallacy around this is to try to label people. I quite frankly think that no one is so simple that they can be encompassed by any single label. Plus, I think that it doesn't matter how one is labeled. You know, I might call myself this or that. You may choose to believe me or not, but it really doesn't matter. What really matters is how I vote. In fact, I once ran into, years ago when I was a Liberal candidate, I'll just tell you a quick story. I ran into another Liberal candidate at a cocktail reception, and she didn't know me, I didn't know her. I walked up to this group of people and heard her sounding forth about the fact that she was actually, the label she applied to herself was pro-choice, but if she ever said that in her riding, she'd never get elected. So her plan was to tell everybody she was personally pro-life and just had to vote this way or that because of this or that consideration. So what I learned from that was that I don't question anybody what they say about what's in their heart, but I do say that it isn't really a matter for public policy what's in your heart. What's a matter for public policy is how you vote. So I don't know whether there may, not be. In fact, I've spoken to some people who identify themselves to me, label themselves as pro-choice, who say, you know what, you're right. We really should have a law that does recognize children as a human being, at least in the third trimester. But, for this reason or that, I'm hesitant to vote that way, So I don't care that they label themselves pro-choice or anything else. It's how people vote that counts.
Who voted in favor of the motion. Can you explain that number you gave us? You said 50% women, 50% men voted in favor?
No.
No, I'm sorry, I didn't say that. I was referring to the petitions that I've received, and I don't mean it as a scientific analysis, because I started by confessing that I didn't sit down and I didn't take the time to do a scientific analysis, but just glancing at the names as I was presenting petitions, it was my general impression that they reflected our demographic of roughly 50% women, 50% men. That's all I meant to say.
Mr. Woodworth, I was asking what you would say to a woman in a shelter, a teenager who had been a victim of incest and who is now seeking an abortion.
Well, the first thing that you need to understand is that Motion 312 says nothing about that, right? So.
Just going to open the door to criminalizing abortion.
Well, as I was explaining earlier, a lawyer or a good legislator actually reads the proposal that is being made and judges the merits of that proposal. And so the proposal that I made has nothing to do with that. But I will try to give you another perspective also, and that is, I might think that a woman in those circumstances might benefit from knowing the facts. That isn't necessarily as stark as it sounds. I don't mean that to be sardonic, if that's the word, but that a woman in those circumstances might benefit from knowing the facts and might benefit from knowing whether or not the life she was carrying was in fact someone who was a human being or was only a collection of cells or a blob of tissue. That might be relevant information for decision making, even for women. And our law actually misleads women. If you didn't know anything else about it, if you weren't sophisticated, and you heard that Canadian law says a child is not a human being until the moment of complete birth, the unsophisticated might actually take that as true. Law has a bit of a teaching function, At least that's what my law professors used to tell me 40 years ago or so. So I think it's relevant information, and we ought not to hide from the facts. Yes.
Does this motion hurt your party at all?
the Prime Minister has come out and said, no, we don't want to reopen this debate. It's been an issue with opposition parties basically accusing your party of wanting to reopen the abortion debate. So how do you think this has played from within your party?
My belief is that I cannot serve my party, I cannot serve my constituents, I cannot serve my party leader by becoming someone I'm not, by setting aside the convictions by which I live my life. And let me put it the other way around, in fact. I believe I can serve my party and my leader and my constituents and the people of Canada best when I am true to my convictions. So I would say that it is those in the opposition who are trying to convince people to act against their convictions, to not be who they are, that are actually the ones trying to weaken the Conservative Party.
Campaigning with your colleagues, trying to convince your colleagues to support your motion, what argument did you find was the most effective?
The most
resonated the most with them, that may have convinced the greatest number of people to vote with you tonight?
You know, it was so variable that it would depend on the individual and the conversation we were having. But I did come up with a little aphorism or saying that I hope will go down in history, and that is, if you find yourself wrestling with your conscience about something, just give in to your conscience.
To go back to the previous question, did your own party not try to change people's minds in voting on this, and not try to ask them to vote against the motion?
You need to, I'm sorry, as a lawyer, as a parliamentarian, I need to be very clear in meanings, and so of course when we say party, we're really talking about thousands and thousands of Conservative members across the country.
In your party.
Yes. I know that the Prime Minister didn't agree with me on this issue, and I would expect the Prime Minister, as a man of conviction, to do what he could to advance his convictions and his point of view. And I don't find anything at all wrong with that, any more than I would expect him to find anything wrong with my advancing my convictions and my point of view.
Just to clarify something, because I arrived late, you said that there's a consensus in Canada in favor of what you were proposing, right?
I believe so.
So how did the motion fail to pass then?
Well, the manner in which a democratic consensus actually achieves completion is a long and twisted road. You know, people often remind me that Wilberforce spent, was it 40 years or 20? I should be careful. I'm not one to quote chapter and verse of anything, but the very first motion that Wilberforce moved in the British House of Commons to abolish the slave trade, did you know it passed? It passed in the House of Commons. Then it went to the House of Lords, where they shifted it this way and that, and it didn't come to a vote. And Wilberforce spent at least the next 20 years, if not 40, having to go back at it and go back at it again. Now, quite frankly, I'm pretty convinced that the people of Britain at that time well understood that Africans, British Africans, were human beings, and it just took that long for the House of Commons and the House of Lords to actually take that consensus and move it. Consider the American case. You know, the American Declaration of Independence says that all men are created equal, and yet it took 70 or more years and a civil war for their law to finally catch up with what everybody knew.
Where are you going to focus your work now? Are you going to focus more on your Trans-Canada tour now, or are you more going to focus here on trying to convince your colleagues to advance it some other way?
I haven't completely discerned a specific strategy. Indeed, what I will want to do is to speak to my colleagues who share with me a desire to fight for the inherent worth and dignity of every human being, and I will want to get their opinions about it. I hope that's not too disappointing, but I've been pretty busy pursuing motion 312, and I'm maybe a little more thoughtful or slower than I should be.
I read late, so I hope I'm not reiterating. Do you believe that your private member's bill may not have been viewed as a private member's bill by other members in the House?
I can't conceive that anybody would have that point of view, at least after the Prime Minister made his position clear. He made it clear that he didn't agree with the motion, and he didn't do it in any way that would suggest any prevarication. So, I mean, people will believe what they want to believe, but that's pretty far-fetched.
Plans to bring forward any, and I know you still have to think about this, but at this point, any other bills or motions coming forward?
Well, unfortunately, the rules of Parliament limit the ability of a member to take any private member's business forward to a vote. So I honestly don't expect my name will come up on the rotation again in the course of this Parliament. So just think about it. I was elected in 2008. I was like number 242 in the last Parliament. It will probably be 2016 before I get another opportunity to move a matter in this way, and maybe not even then. So you're looking at once in every 7 or 8 years that you can move a matter to a vote.
Any of your colleagues who might put forward a motion or a bill?
Well, you'd have to check the roster, but I should also tell you that generally speaking, I never try to speak for anyone except myself.
Will this come up again in Parliament?
Well, until the issue is closed, I certainly expect it will. This issue has been open for 25 years. It's not true to say that I've reopened anything. It's been opened by the courts time and again, saying this is for Parliament. It's opened by virtue of the fact that every year in Ottawa, in Parliament, we get between 10 and 20,000 Canadians who come to Parliament asking Parliament to resolve this, among other issues. So it's never been closed, and Parliament has just missed an opportunity to try and bring us to consensus. So it's not closed now either, and so I think it's going to remain open for the foreseeable future. Very good, yeah. Thank you all very much. Oh.